The life and legacy of George Washington, father of a nation. In the quiet hills of the county of West Anne, Virginia, on February 22, 1732, a boy was born who would shape the foundations of a new world. He was called George Washington, and, although he came into the world without fortune or noble blood, his destiny was written in the stars. George was the son of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, members of the Virginia aristocracy, though not among the richest. When George was only 11 years old, his father died, leaving his education somewhat limited, but what he lacked in formal education, he made up for with ambition, discipline, and curiosity. He studied surveying, geometry, and practical subjects, and at 17, he became a professional surveyor exploring the vast, wild lands of the Virginia frontier. The young man learned to function in the landscape and the complex politics of colonial life. The seeds of leadership were planted early. At 20 years old, Washington joined the Virginia militia, and at 22, he was involved in the Franco-Indian War, a brutal conflict between Great Britain and France for control of North America. His first important experience came in 1754 at Fort Necessity, where he led a small force and suffered defeat. But even in defeat, he gained something invaluable: a reputation for courage, determination, and composure under pressure. Later, he served under the command of the British General Braddock in a disastrous campaign near Fort Duquesne, where he became a hero for rallying the troops in the midst of chaos. These early experiences forged a military mindset that valued preparation, patience, and strategic thinking. At the end of the war, Washington resigned from the militia and returned to Virginia, where a new chapter awaited him. In 1759, George married the wealthy widow Martha Custis, who brought him land and 2 stepsons to his life at Mount Vernon, his plantation overlooking the Potomac River. He became a Virginia gentleman, dedicating himself to agriculture, entertainment, and the management of his properties. Though he lived comfortably, Washington remained restless. He was deeply committed to colonial politics and served in the House of Burgesses of Virginia, and observing with growing frustration the treatment that Great Britain gave to its American colonies. When Parliament imposed new taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the Tea Act, Washington joined others in boycotting British products, aligning himself with the growing wave of resistance. A storm was brewing, and Washington was prepared. In 1775, when conflict broke out in Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to decide how to respond. Washington, tall, dignified, and dressed in his military uniform, was appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. What followed were 8 exhausting years of war against the most powerful empire on earth. Washington's leadership kept the nascent army together despite early defeats in New York, winters in Valley Forge, and shortages of resources. But his resilience, his unwavering sense of duty, and his willingness to listen to his generals eventually changed the course of the war with the help of France and strategic victories in Trenton, Princeton, and, finally, Yorktown, Indiana. 1781. Washington forced the British surrender. He could have become king, but instead he resigned his position and returned to private life. It was one of history's most powerful acts, choosing humility over power. In the years after the war, the United States faltered under the weak Articles of Confederation, and calls for a stronger central government grew. In 1787, Washington was elected to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Though he remained silent during the debates, his mere presence gave the meeting legitimacy. When the Constitution of the United States was ratified, there was only one man whom the people trusted to lead this new experiment in freedom. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected first president of the United States. As president, Washington knew he was setting all precedents, since a republic like this had never existed, nor was there a plan of action. He established the cabinet, appointed Alexander Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury, and worked to unify a fragile union of former colonies. He oversaw the creation of the Bill of Rights, calmed internal unrest, such as the Whiskey Rebellion, and directed foreign affairs with neutrality and caution, refusing to involve the United States in European wars. He rejected the symbols of monarchy insisted on being called Mr. President, and resigned after 2 terms, consolidating the principle of peaceful power transfer. In his farewell address, he warned against political parties and permanent alliances with other countries, offering wisdom that is still studied today. After retiring from the presidency in 1797, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, longing for peace and tranquility, but his sense of duty never faded. When war with France loomed in 1798, President John Adams asked Washington to lead the army again. He accepted, though he remained at home. On December 14, 1799, after falling ill with a severe throat infection, George Washington passed away. The nation mourned its first and greatest leader. Napoleon decreed 10 days of mourning in France. British ships lowered their flags, and throughout America bells rang, candles were lit, and tears fell. George Washington was more than a general, more than a president. He was the embodiment of a nation's ideals. He rejected absolute power, established a republic, and gave a nascent country the gift of confidence in leadership. His honesty, integrity, and sense of duty remain a benchmark for presidents and citizens alike. Monuments, cities, and schools bear his name, and his example continues to guide the American spirit. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man standing under a snowy sky in Valley Forge, wrapped in a worn coat, looking at an army that believes in him. Imagine him riding into New York at war's end, modest and humble, walking away from power, not clinging to it, standing under the stars of a new flag, not knowing what the future holds, but willing to lead, because George Washington believed in the impossible dream of a free republic. That dream became reality. John Adams, the reluctant patriot. On October 30th, 1735, in the modest town of Braintree, Massachusetts, a boy was born who would help forge a nation from rebellion. He was called John Adams, and although his fame would always be in the shadow of larger-than-life figures, his role in the founding of the United States was profound. Son of a farmer and shoemaker, young John grew up with a strong sense of duty, education, and faith. He was a lively, witty, and independent child, although he did not like school at first. His brilliant mind eventually led him to Harvard University, where he studied law and fell in love with the power of ideas. John's early ambition was to make his mark on the world, not through war or wealth, but through words and justice. Adams began his career as a lawyer in Boston, where he quickly gained a reputation for intellect and integrity. He defended what was right, even when it was unpopular. In 1770, when British soldiers fired on a crowd during the Boston Massacre, killing 5 civilians, Adams took on the difficult task of defending the soldiers in court. He believed that every person deserved a fair trial, and although his defense was controversial, he won for most defendants. "Facts are stubborn things," he said in court. It was a lesson that the United States would later learn. But while Adams defended British soldiers in court, his heart was increasingly drawn to the cause of American independence. As tensions with Great Britain increased, Adams became a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congresses, where he stood as an ardent advocate for separation. He nominated George Washington to lead the Continental Army, tirelessly advocated for rebellion, and ultimately played a key role in drafting and approving the Declaration in 1776. Although Thomas Jefferson was chosen to draft the document, Adams defended it with relentless passion. The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of the United States, he predicted, unaware that the signing on the 4th would become a celebrated date. In reality, John Adams was the engine of independence. After the start of the Revolution, Adams was sent across the Atlantic as a diplomat, braving storms and wars to forge alliances and secure peace. He negotiated with France and the Dutch Republic and eventually helped draft the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war in 1783. Despite the harsh winters, hostile politics, and months of loneliness away from his beloved wife Abigail Adams, he stood firm. His letters to Abigail, written with love, wit, and nostalgia, are among the most beautiful and revealing in United States history. Together, they were equals, partners in the birth of a nation. When the new government of the United States was formed under the Constitution, Adams was elected the first vice president, holding office under George Washington from 1789 to 1797. Although the position offered little influence, Adams famously described it as the most insignificant office that man ever invented. Despite this, he remained loyal to the young republic, presiding over the Senate and observing the formation of the nascent government. It was a time of ideological divisions, with emerging political factions led by the Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. Adams, a Federalist, believed in a strong central government and feared the rise of populism and mob rule. In 1796, Adams became the second president of the United States, narrowly defeating his friend and rival Thomas Jefferson, who became vice president under the old electoral system. His presidency was marked by tension and turmoil, the quasi-war with France, a naval conflict born of diplomatic ruptures, and the Alien and Sedition Acts passed under his administration, which were criticized as oppressive and un-American. Despite the conflicts, Adams made perhaps his most important decision in 1800, when he refused to go to war with France, even under enormous pressure from his own party. He chose peace over popularity, which cost him re-election, but history would prove him right. In 1800, Adams lost the presidency to Thomas Jefferson, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between political rivals in United States history. It was a memorable moment for the young republic. Adams left Washington quietly and returned to his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, where he spent his last years in reflection, reading, writing, and enjoying time with his family. He and Jefferson eventually rekindled their friendship and exchanged a famous series of letters in which they discussed philosophy, politics, and their shared history. Two giants of the Revolution, once bitter enemies, became wise, old friends. On July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams lay dying. His last words are said to have been, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Unbeknownst to him, Jefferson had passed away a few hours earlier. The two revolutionaries, born in opposition but united by a common purpose, passed away on the same day as their nation's birthday. It was as if destiny had woven poetry into history. John Adams never sought fame. He was proud and often misunderstood, but he was also brilliant, upright, and indispensable. He was the architect of independence, the conscience of the revolution, and a relentless voice for law, reason, and Republican values. He understood the dangers of unchecked power and the fragility of freedom. His love for Abigail, his family, and his country shines through the centuries. Today we remember him not for his glory or charisma, but for his unwavering devotion to the idea of the United States. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man sitting at his desk, with a candle flickering and pen scratching parchment. He is writing to his wife, drafting a defense of freedom, or struggling with the burdens of a fragile nation. He does not seek praise. He does what must be done because John Adams believed that honor was worth more than popularity. A new nation had found its voice. Thomas Jefferson, the writer of freedom. In the gentle hills of Shadwell, Virginia, on April 13, 1743, a boy was born who would write the most powerful words in United States history. His name was Thomas Jefferson, and from the moment he learned to read, he devoured the world. He grew up on a plantation with his father, Peter Jefferson, surveyor and planter, and his mother, Jane Randolph, a descendant of one of Virginia's most prominent families. Young Thomas grew up surrounded by books, forests, and ideas. His father died when he was only 14, but he left him a world of knowledge. Jefferson would become a Renaissance man, a thinker, writer, inventor, architect, musician, and farmer. He was quiet, but his mind burned like fire. Jefferson attended the College of William and Mary, where he studied Latin, Greek, philosophy, and law. He was shaped by the Enlightenment, a belief in reason, science, and the perfectibility of man. At 20 years old, he was already practicing law and serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where his belief in freedom and limited government took root. He admires John Locke, studies Newton, and fills his library with volumes on government, architecture, and agriculture, but it is not until the 1770s that Jefferson truly begins to shape a nation. In 1776, as the colonies slowly move towards total rebellion, the Continental Congress appoints a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. Jefferson, the youngest member, is chosen to write it, and so, in a rented room in Philadelphia, with a quill pen and a heart full of conviction, Jefferson writes these immortal words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776, and the world changed. Jefferson had given voice to a revolution. After independence, Jefferson was governor of Virginia, guiding the state through the chaos of war. He was criticized for his handling of the British invasions, but his dedication to public education, legislative reform, and religious freedom left an indelible mark. Later, he was minister to France, following in the footsteps of Benjamin Franklin. There he observed the first tremors of the French Revolution, empathizing with the ideals, but fearing its violent extremes. During those years, tragedy struck. His beloved wife Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson, whom he adored, passed away in 1782. Jefferson was devastated. He promised her that he would never remarry and kept her memory alive in every corner of his home. Upon returning to the United States, Jefferson was appointed Secretary of State under President George Washington, but clashes with Alexander Hamilton, his Federalist rival, soon defined his role. Jefferson led the Democratic Republicans, who defended popular democracy against industrial capitalism, states' rights against centralized power, and freedom against order. He believed that the strength of the United States lay in its farmers, not its bankers. The political division between Jefferson and Hamilton would mark the future of American parties. After serving as vice president under John Adams, Jefferson ran for president in 1800. The campaign was brutal, full of defamatory rumors and divisions. But Jefferson won after a dramatic tie in the Electoral College and a tense decision by the House of Representatives. His election was the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing parties in United States history. In his inaugural address, he uttered the famous phrase, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." He sought unity and embarked on a presidency of monumental achievements. As president, Jefferson reduced the national debt, cut military spending, and repealed unpopular taxes. But his greatest legacy was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, with which he acquired 828,000 square miles of land from France for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States. Although Jefferson had doubts about the constitutionality of the purchase, he believed in the vision of an empire of liberty, a nation of free farmers stretching from coast to coast. He also sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the new territory, initiating one of the most legendary expeditions in United States history. Not all of Jefferson's term was a triumph. His second term was marred by tensions with Great Britain and France, whose naval conflicts disrupted American trade. Jefferson responded with the Embargo Act of 1807, which halted American exports. The law backfired, damaging American trade and earning widespread criticism. In 1809, he retired to Monticello, his beloved estate in Virginia, where he designed buildings, experimented with crops, and corresponded with friends and enemies alike. He also founded the University of Virginia, which he called the hobby of my old age. He believed that education was the safeguard of democracy. In his last years, Jefferson rekindled a remarkable friendship with John Adams, his former rival. Their letters are a treasure trove of philosophical reflections, humor, and love for their country. On July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson passed away at Monticello. John Adams did so a few hours later. Two giants of the Revolution departed on the same day, as if heaven were honoring their lifelong service. Jefferson's life was full of contradictions. He wrote that all men are created equal, but he owned slaves, including Sally Hemings, with whom he likely had several children. He dreamed of freedom, but lived in a system of slavery. Today we remember Jefferson as a visionary and an imperfect man whose pen gave voice to the ideals of a new nation. He designed Monticello, drafted the Declaration, founded a university, and inspired generations. His belief in freedom, education, and democratic ideals still resonates around the world. Close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by your dreams. Imagine a room lit with candles in Philadelphia, a quiet man leaning over a desk, ink-stained fingers guiding pen on the parchment. He is writing a promise, a bold declaration that people are born free, that the government is at the service of the governed, and that the world can be different. Because Thomas Jefferson believed in the power of ideas, the world changed. The life and legacy of James Madison, the quiet architect from the peaceful countryside of Port Conway, Virginia. On March 16, 1751, a child was born who would one day draft the foundations of a nation. His name was James Madison, and although he was small, barely measuring 150 m, often fragile and soft-spoken, his mind was an imposing force. Raised on a tobacco plantation in Orange County, Madison was the eldest of 12 siblings from a wealthy but down-to-earth family. From a very young age, he was known for his intense curiosity, devouring books with the appetite of a philosopher. He studied Latin, Greek, history, mathematics, and law, and was drawn to the great thinkers of the Enlightenment at the University of Princeton and then at the College of New Jersey, where he completed a 4-year degree in two, driven by his thirst for knowledge. He would become the most studious, perhaps the most introverted of all the founding fathers. But tranquility should never be confused with weakness. Madison would design the plans for a nation. In the 1770s, the colonies were seething, but Madison, although not a passionate speaker or a war hero, deeply believed in freedom and representative government. He served in the legislature of the state of Virginia and became friends with Thomas Jefferson, with whom he would share a lifelong bond. In 1780, Madison was elected a member of the Continental Congress, where he became an advocate for strengthening the fragile American government. He saw firsthand how the Articles of Confederation left the new nation weak and fractured, and began to dream of a system that could balance freedom with unity, state power with federal strength, a system bold enough to endure. In 1787, Madison arrived in Philadelphia with a plan even before the Constitutional Convention began. He drafted a detailed project, which became known as the Virginia Plan, in which he proposed a government with 3 branches and a system of checks and balances. During the convention, Madison spoke more than 150 times, took meticulous notes, and became the intellectual heart of the meeting. Although many men contributed, it was Madison who provided the architecture for the Constitution of the United States. Later, together with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, he wrote the Federalist Papers, persuasive essays in defense of the Constitution. Madison's essays, especially Federalist No. 10 and No. 51, are still studied today for their brilliance. When explaining democracy, he had helped build a government not of kings or mobs, but of reason and law. Although Madison had at some point doubted the need for amendments, he listened to critics who feared that the Constitution lacked protections for individual liberties. Once in the first Congress, as a representative of Virginia, Madison took the lead in drafting what would become the Bill of Rights. In 1791, 10 amendments were ratified guaranteeing freedom of expression, religion, the press, and due process. Madison had once again demonstrated that he was not only an architect, but a guardian of freedom. In 1794, at the age of 43, Madison married Dolly Payne Todd, a young widow full of life, charm, grace, and social brilliance. While Madison was reserved, Dolly shone. She would become one of the most beloved first ladies in history, organizing salons and political gatherings that softened even the harshest divisions. Together, they formed a perfect political couple, his intellect and her warmth. Madison was Secretary of State under President Jefferson, helping to manage the Louisiana Purchase and defending American navigation rights against British and French interference. But soon it would be Madison's turn to take the helm. In 1809, James Madison became the fourth president of the United States, inheriting a nation increasingly caught between European powers. The War of 1812 would define his presidency, driven by British violations of American sovereignty, which impressed sailors and blockaded trade. Madison reluctantly asked Congress to declare war. The war was chaotic, ill-prepared, and controversial. In 1814, British troops invaded Washington, D.C., and burned the White House. Dali saved important documents and a portrait of George Washington before fleeing. But the war ended in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent, and a new sense of American identity was born. The defense of New Orleans, led by Andrew Jackson, aroused patriotism and pride. Madison, who had been a quiet student, had presided over one of the most dramatic chapters in United States history. After leaving office in 1817, Madison retired to his Montpelier estate in the foothills of Virginia. He spent his last years dedicating himself to agriculture, managing his debts, and continuing his deep interest in constitutional theory. He was also rector of the University of Virginia, where he helped Jefferson train a new generation of thinkers. As regional tensions over slavery increased, Madison, like many of his contemporaries, struggled with contradictions. Although he opposed the international slave trade and hoped for gradual emancipation, he owned slaves throughout his life. His legacy, like Jefferson's, is marked as much by an extraordinary vision as by a disturbing hypocrisy. James Madison died on June 28, 1836, at the age of 85, and was the last surviving signatory of the Constitution. He had outlived his companions, had seen the country he helped create grow and suffer, and left a legacy of thoughtful government, deliberate debate, and constitutional devotion. His words remain engraved in law, and his vision remains alive in all branches of government. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a small man in a high chair surrounded by books, maps, and drafts. His hand moves over the parchment, writing about checks and balances, factions, and freedoms of a republic based on law. He is not looking for fame. He is building something bigger, a system in which ideas govern, not men, because James Madison believed in reflective freedom. The American experiment found its lasting form. James Monroe, the last founding father. On April 28, 1758, in the quiet woods in Westland County, Virginia, a boy was born who would one day become the fifth president of the United States. His name was James Monroe, and although less flamboyant than some of his revolutionary companions, his legacy would be lasting. He was the son of a modest planter and carpenter, and, after his father's premature death, young James assumed family responsibilities, but also continued with his education, eventually enrolling at the College of William and Mary in 1776. At only 18 years old, Monroe left college to join the Continental Army. The cause of freedom called him, and he would answer it for the rest of his life. Monroe joined the 3rd Regiment of Virginia, serving bravely under General George Washington. He fought in the Battle of Trenton, where he was wounded in the shoulder during the daring Christmas attack across the Delaware River. He endured the hardships of Valley Forge and earned the respect of his fellow patriots. Although he rose to the rank of major, Monroe left active service to study law with Thomas Jefferson, forging a friendship and mentorship that would last a lifetime and shape his future. His service in the Army provided him with a foundation of sacrifice, duty, and the cause of independence. Monroe entered politics as a delegate to the Continental Congress and later helped draft the new Virginia Constitution. He served in the United States Senate and later was governor of Virginia, not once, but twice in the 1790s. Monroe was appointed minister to France by President Washington. Although his diplomatic style was too warm for the taste of the Federalists, he became popular among the French during their Revolution, sympathizing with their struggle for freedom. Later, as minister to Great Britain, he worked to ease tensions during the tense post-war years, though not always successfully. Even so, Monroe was a trusted envoy and public official who always fought for unity and freedom. Under the presidency of James Madison, Monroe held the positions of Secretary of State and Secretary of War during the War of 1812, being the only person in United States history to hold both positions simultaneously. With Washington defeated and morale low, Monroe helped reorganize the Army, guide strategy, and rebuild confidence. His leadership helped secure the American victory and made him a steady and capable hand in times of crisis. When the war ended and Madison's term concluded, Monroe was the natural successor. In 1817, James Monroe became the 5th President of the United States. His presidency marked the beginning of what historians call the era of good feelings, an era of national unity, economic growth, and post-war optimism. Monroe toured the country, shaking hands with veterans, listening to citizens, and earning the respect of all parties, even though political division was latent. Monroe avoided getting involved in partisan dramas. He believed in American nationalism, economic development, and westward expansion. Perhaps Monroe's most lasting legacy came in 1823, when he delivered a message to Congress that would define American foreign policy for generations. In his annual message, Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to European colonization and that the United States would oppose interference in the affairs of independent nations of America. This bold stance, later known as the Monroe Doctrine, affirmed the influence of the United States in the New World and became the cornerstone of American diplomacy. Although it was largely drafted by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, it was named after Monroe and reflected his determination. During the presidency of Monroe, the United States acquired Florida from Spain through the Adams-Onis Treaty and saw 5 new states join the Union, but growth also brought division. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, signed by Monroe, admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes line, which temporarily appeased tensions, but the issue of slavery would resurface. Monroe, who was a slave owner, hoped that the country could avoid disunity, but his legacy, like that of many founders, remains entangled in that deep contradiction. After 2 terms, Monroe retired from public life in 1825, returned to Virginia, and struggled with debts, like many former presidents. His beloved wife, Elizabeth Cartwright Monroe, a quiet and elegant First Lady, passed away in 1830. Monroe moved to New York City to live with his daughter. There, on July 4, 1831, 5 years after the deaths of Jefferson and Adams, James Monroe passed away at the age of 73. 3 founding fathers, 3 former presidents, all died on the anniversary of the nation they helped create. The symbolism was astonishing. James Monroe was the last president who had fought in the War of Independence and the last of the so-called Virginia dynasty. Although less eloquent than Jefferson or bolder than Washington, Monroe was a steadfast man, a unifying figure, and a man who put the nation before himself. His doctrine lived on, invoked by presidents from Lincoln to Roosevelt and Kennedy. His belief in the strength, the dignity, and the independence of the United States continues giving form to the politics and the perspective, and although he lived in a world of compromises and complexity, he continues being a symbol of calm leadership. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man walking through the fields of Virginia, remembering when he was young, injured, and marched through the snow behind George Washington. Imagine him standing before Congress, calmly announcing to the world that the United States would remain firm and defend its neighbors. Imagine a man who never sought glory, but who carried in his heart the memory of the Revolution and the weight of a growing nation on his shoulders, because James Monroe believed in strength through unity. The nation that he helped nurture continued to grow. John Quincy Adams, the reluctant champion. On July 11, 1767, in a small wooden house in Braintree, Massachusetts, a child was born in the very heart of the foundational storm of the United States. He was called John Quincy Adams, and his father was none other than John Adams, future second president of the United States. His mother, Abigail Adams, was a woman of great intellect and a tireless moral compass. As a child, John Quincy witnessed the American Revolution with his own eyes from atop a hill, observing the Battle of Bunker Hill. He traveled through Europe during his father's diplomatic missions and even met world leaders such as Catherine the Great and Benjamin Franklin before he was old enough to vote. He was not born into a privileged family, but with purpose. John Quincy Adams mastered several languages in his adolescence, studied in European academies, attended Harvard University, and absorbed the philosophies of freedom, government, and diplomacy. At only 14 years old, he was secretary of the American envoy in Russia, and at 26, he was appointed Minister of the United States to the Netherlands. Shortly after, he became Minister to Prussia. Even George Washington praised his diplomatic talent and described him as the most capable of all our young men. He received the education of a prince, but his mission was always the Republic. In 1803, Adams was elected senator for Massachusetts. Although he was a Federalist by party, he followed his conscience more than any faction, often to the detriment of his political career. He supported Thomas Jefferson in the Louisiana Purchase, which angered his party and demonstrated that he cared more about principles than popularity. His independence earned him the reputation of a nonconformist, a man guided by vision and not vanity. Shortly after, President James Madison appointed a minister to Russia and later to Great Britain, where he helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, which put an end to the War of 1812. His diplomacy helped repair a young, wounded nation under the mandate of President James Monroe. Adams held the position of Secretary of State, and it was here that he achieved greatness. He orchestrated the Adams-Onis Treaty, by which Florida was acquired from Spain and the border of the United States with the Spanish territory in the West was established. He supported internal improvements and commercial expansion, believing in a strong and growing republic. But his most famous legacy was the Monroe Doctrine. Although it was named after Monroe, it was Adams who drafted the bold policy that America would no longer be open to European colonization. It was a clear message. The Western Hemisphere belonged to the New World. He had laid the diplomatic foundations of American power. In 1824, Adams ran for the presidential election in a close contest in which Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford also participated. Although Jackson won the popular vote, no candidate obtained a majority in the Electoral College, so the decision fell to the House of Representatives with the support of Clay. Adams was elected, and Jackson's supporters cried fraud, calling it a corrupt bargain. From the moment he took office, his presidency was marked by suspicion. Even so, Adams pursued ambitious goals, such as the construction of national universities, scientific institutions, and an extensive transportation network. He imagined a United States united by roads, canals, and ideas, but the Congress, dominated by the Jacksonian opposition, frustrated many of his initiatives. His was a mandate of frustrated brilliance. After losing the election of 1828 to Andrew Jackson, Adams could have retired, but instead, he embarked on a second historic term. In 1831, he was elected a member of the House of Representatives, becoming the only former president to serve in Congress. There he found his true voice and defended infrastructures, science, and, above all, the abolition of slavery. He was known as the eloquent old man for his passionate speeches and his tireless defense of the cause. For 17 years, he fought against the gag rule, which prevented motions against slavery in Congress. He fought for the right to speak on behalf of those who had no voice. In 1841, Adams defended before the Supreme Court the enslaved Africans who had taken control of the ship Amistad after being illegally trafficked. Despite his advanced age and fragile health, Adams remained in court for 4 hours defending their right to freedom with powerful oratory and moral conviction. He won the case. It was a triumph not only of the law, but also of conscience. In February 1848, while speaking on the floor of the House, John Quincy Adams collapsed at his desk. They took him to the Speaker's room, where he died 2 days later. His last words were, "This is the end of Earth. I am happy." He had served his country for over 50 years across 3 continents and 6 presidencies. John Quincy Adams was not a populist. He was not a war hero. He was never the most loved of men, but he was brilliant, principled and inflexible. He believed in education, diplomacy, justice, and truth. He believed that the United States could be better, not only richer or bigger, but more just and free. And although his term as president was brief, his legacy as a moral force in American politics remains unmatched. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine an old man walking through the halls of Congress, hunched over, but never silenced. Imagine him standing before the Supreme Court, defending the rights of slaves with a trembling voice and iron will. Imagine a child watching the Revolution and a man who never stopped fighting for its promise, because John Quincy Adams believed in duty beyond office and in truth above power. The United States continued fighting for the light and attracted Jackson, the storm, and the sword. On March 15, 1767, in a remote settlement on the border between North and South Carolina, a child was born into poverty, hardship, and the echoes of rebellion. His name was Andrew Jackson, and his life would be marked by conflict, from orphanhood to battlefields and the Oval Office. His father died before he was born, and at 14, Jackson had lost his mother and two brothers to the ravages of the American Revolutionary War. Captured by the British, he was beaten by an officer for refusing to clean his boots, a scar that never disappeared. These early wounds made him a man of determination, rage, and unwavering will. Jackson studied law in North Carolina and moved west to the frontier town of Nashville, Tennessee, where he established a successful law firm. He was quick with his temper and quicker with his gun, earning a reputation as brilliant and brutal in Nashville. There he met Rachel Donaldson, a woman whose complicated divorce led to years of scandals and rumors. Despite everything, they married, and Jackson adored her with a burning devotion that lasted his entire life. The law gave him influence, but war gave him fame. During the War of 1812, Jackson commanded American forces against Native American tribes and the British. His relentless pursuit of victory earned him the nickname Old Hickory, as hard and unyielding as the tree itself. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, he defeated the Creek Nation, opening up vast territory to American settlers. Soon after, he achieved one of the most impressive victories in United States history at the Battle of New Orleans, where his motley army repelled an experienced British force with minimal casualties. He became a national hero, the embodiment of frontier rebelliousness. In the years after the war, Jackson led military campaigns in Spanish Florida, confronting tribes and executing foreign agents, sparking a diplomatic uproar. His audacity led to the Adams-Onis Treaty, which ceded Florida to the United States. He briefly held the position of governor before returning to Tennessee, but behind the victories hid a darker legacy, rooted in a vision of American expansion that would later define one of the most painful chapters in United States history. In 1824, Jackson ran for president against John Quincy Adams, winning the popular vote but losing in the House of Representatives. Enraged, he denounced the corrupt deal that gave the presidency to Adams and swore revenge. In 1828, Jackson ran again and this time won, becoming the seventh president of the United States and the first to rise from humble origins. For many, he was the defender of the common man, for some a populist tyrant, but everyone agreed that Jackson could not be ignored. Jackson's presidency, from 1829 to 1837, marked the beginning of a new era of American democracy. He expanded suffrage for white men, attacked the entrenched political elite, and positioned himself as the voice of the people. He wielded the presidential veto as a weapon, ending the second bank of the United States, which he considered a corrupt tool of the rich. "I was born for the storm. Calm does not suit me," he once said, and indeed his presidency was a storm. Perhaps the most controversial and tragic act of Jackson's presidency was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. He believed that Native American nations had no place in the expanding United States and pushed policies that pushed them west despite opposition and a Supreme Court ruling in the Worcester versus Georgia case that sided with the Cherokees. Jackson went ahead, and the result was the Trail of Tears, a forced migration that caused the suffering and death of thousands of people and remains a stain on his legacy impossible to ignore. Jackson also faced a secession crisis years before the Civil War, when South Carolina threatened to nullify federal tariffs and break with the Union. Jackson responded with a firm warning. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you willing to incur that guilt? He sent troops to enforce the law, and a compromise averted the crisis. Jackson had preserved the Union, but revealed the tensions that would later erupt into war. Jackson retired in 1837 to the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation. There he wrote letters, received visitors, and watched as the country he had shaped continued to evolve. He mourned the death of Rachel, who had passed away before he took office, and remained dedicated to her memory. He died on June 8, 1845, surrounded by family and friends. His last words were, "Be good children all, and strive to be prepared when the change comes." Andrew Jackson's legacy is contradictory. He expanded democracy while denying it to many, strengthened the presidency while challenging the Supreme Court, was a hero to some and a villain to others, but he changed the office, the nation, and the very meaning of what it was to be American. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man on horseback, silhouetted against the fire of cannons, sword raised. Imagine that same man standing alone in the Oval Office, resolute, inflexible, ready to face the storm. He had defects, he was fierce, he was a force, because Andrew Jackson believed the people should govern. The presidency became a pulpit and the nation a battlefield of ideals. Martin Van Buren, the little magician in the picturesque town of Kinderhook, New York, on December 5, 1782, a child was born who one day would charm, intrigue, and make his way to the White House. His name was Martin Van Buren, and he would be the first president born after the American Revolution, the first citizen of the United States, and the first to demonstrate that politics was a game and that he knew how to play it better than anyone. His parents were of Dutch descent, and Martin grew up speaking Dutch as his mother tongue, and only learned English as he grew up. His father was a tavern keeper and farmer, which gave young Martin early access to political conversations, gossip, and negotiations at travelers' tables. The child who listened silently in a corner of the tavern would one day orchestrate the rise of modern American politics. Van Buren was brilliant, witty, and ambitious. He studied law through an apprenticeship, never attended college, and became a lawyer at age 21, but it was politics that attracted him to the New York State Senate. Van Buren became a master of political organization. He believed in creating coalitions, in creating networks, and in keeping his friends close and his rivals even closer. He helped form the Albany Regency, a powerful political machine in New York. People began calling him the Little Magician for his ability to make deals, unite factions, and quietly rise without drawing too much attention. He was not a fighter, but a strategist. In the 1820s, Van Buren had become a United States senator and was rapidly becoming a force in national politics. He opposed elitism and supported the rise of the Democratic Party, defending the rights of the common man. He saw in Andrew Jackson a soul mate, strong, popular, and indomitable. Van Buren helped organize Jackson's presidential campaign in 1828, creating a national party with unprecedented discipline. In return, Jackson appointed Van Buren Secretary of State and, later, Vice President during his second term. The two men were very different in style. Jackson was the storm and Van Buren, the calm wind that redirected it in 1836. Jackson endorsed Van Buren as his successor. The little magician had reached the top. Martin Van Buren became the seventh president of the United States in 1837, taking office just as the country fell into the Panic of 1837, a devastating financial crisis in which banks collapsed, businesses went bankrupt, and unemployment soared. Although the seeds of the panic had been planted before his presidency, Van Buren bore the blame. He resisted calls for the federal government to intervene forcefully, believing in limited government and fiscal discipline. He created the independent treasury system, which separated federal funds from private banks, a policy praised in retrospect but controversial at the time. The panic stained his presidency. Despite the economic problems, Van Buren remained popular with many. He was elegant, educated, and a gifted conversationalist. He restored a sense of decorum to the presidency after Jackson's turbulent years. He was also a fierce opponent of the expansion of slavery, and although cautious in his approach, he tried to balance abolitionist pressures and Southern resistance. Few could follow his narrow political line, but in 1840 conservatives rallied around William Henry Harrison, a war hero, and used catchy slogans such as hard cider, hard as a rock, and images of log cabins to present Van Buren as a man out of touch with reality. Van Buren is a Finnish man, they shouted, and it worked. Van Buren lost the re-election by an overwhelming majority. After leaving office, Van Buren did not disappear. He tried to return to the presidency in 1844, but lost the Democratic nomination to James K. Polk. In 1848, he took a bold stance against the expansion of slavery and ran as a candidate of the Free Soil Party. He knew he would not win, but he helped steer the national debate toward the abolition of slavery. It was his last campaign, but a campaign based on principles, not ambition. Van Buren retired to his beloved Lindenwold estate in Kinderhook, where he wrote his memoirs, received his guests, and watched the nation become increasingly divided by slavery. He died on July 24, 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, which he had tried to avoid. Although his presidency faltered amid the crisis, his political genius, his ability to create parties, and his opposition to the expansion of slavery made him a vital link in the evolution of the United States. Martin Van Buren did not win wars or write great declarations, but he built the machinery that made American democracy work. He created the first modern political party, believed in majority rule, and championed the importance of organization, debate, and the peaceful transfer of power. He was a strategist of republics, an orchestra conductor of democracy. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man in an elegant coat strolling through a quiet study with pen in hand, whispering strategies that move nations. Imagine him drinking coffee at dawn, reviewing letters from all corners of the country, silently weaving alliances that hold together a fragile union. Because Martin Van Buren believed that politics could be an art, the United States became a more democratic and receptive republic. William Henry Harrison, a brief flame. On February 9, 1773, in the heart of Charles City County, Virginia, a child was born in the middle of the American Revolution. His name was William Henry Harrison, and he came from one of the most distinguished families in Virginia. His father, Benjamin Harrison I, was a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Young William grew up surrounded by the ideals of freedom and good government, amid the echoes of the Revolution and expectations. Although he had initially been destined for medicine, fate had other plans for this restless and determined soul. In 1791, Harrison enlisted in the American Army and quickly distinguished himself in the Northwest Indian War under General Anthony Wayne. His leadership and courage helped secure American control of the Northwest Territory, earning him promotions and recognition. He married Anna Tothill Sim, daughter of a prominent judge, and together they had 10 children, but it was his role as governor of the Indiana Territory that made his name known throughout the young nation. Governor Harrison negotiated territorial agreements with Native American tribes, many of them controversial and disputed, and tensions escalated until 1811, when Harrison led American forces against Tumpa and his confederation in the Battle of Tipo. It was a hard-won victory that consolidated Harrison's reputation as a frontier hero. Tippecanoe and Tyler too would later become the most famous campaign slogan in United States history. His fame only grew during the War of 1812, in which he commanded the American forces in the Northwest, defeated the British troops and their native allies in the Battle of the Thames, and secured the region for the United States. After the war, he was hailed as a national hero. Harrison retired to his farm in North Bend, Ohio, but the call of politics proved too strong. He held positions as congressman, senator, and minister in Columbia, often defending westward expansion and veterans' rights. He was a quiet statesman, known not for grandiloquent rhetoric, but for his sense of duty and service. As tensions over slavery and states' rights increased, Harrison emerged as a unifying figure, a war hero without deep political implications. In 1840, the newly formed Whig Party chose Harrison to run for president against Martin Van Buren. They developed a brilliant campaign in which they presented Harrison as a humble man, a pioneer who lived in a log cabin, drank cider, and spoke on behalf of the common man. In reality, Harrison came from a privileged family, but the image was consolidated with parades, songs, badges, and slogans. The Whig Party encouraged voters like never before. Tippecanoe and Tyler too became a battle cry throughout the country. Harrison won by an overwhelming majority on March 4, 1841. William Henry Harrison was sworn in as the 9th President of the United States at age 68, the oldest man elected to the office at that time. Determined to show himself strong and energetic, he delivered a 2-hour inaugural address, the longest in history, in freezing rain, without a coat or hat. A month later, he had passed away. Harrison fell ill within weeks of taking office. It was initially believed to be mononucleosis, although recent studies suggest it was typhoid fever from contaminated water near the White House. He died on April 4, 1841, just 31 days after taking office. His presidency remains the shortest in United States history. His death set a vital constitutional precedent. Vice President John Tyler assumed all the powers of the presidency, establishing the rule of presidential succession that remains in effect today. Although his presidency was brief, the impact of his death would mark how the nation understood executive power. William Henry Harrison was the first president to die in office. His death shocked the nation and sparked debate, but also unified the country in grief. He is remembered not only for what he could have done as president, but for a life of military valor, public service, and humility. He had lived a full life and died at the height of public confidence. Although his presidency was ephemeral, his influence was felt for decades. His grandson, Benjamin Harrison, would later become the 23rd president. His campaign style helped usher in the era of modern election campaigns. His success in the crisis helped clarify the Constitution's silence on the death of the president. He was not a philosopher or a visionary, but a soldier, a father, and a reluctant politician who served when called. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man in a log cabin, drinking cider with a pointed saber hanging over the fireplace. Imagine him riding in the rain on the day of his inauguration, proud, hopeful, unaware that history would remember him more for how little he lasted than for how much he fought, because William Henry Harrison believed in duty above comfort and gave his all, even if it was only for a month. John Tyler, the accidental president. On March 29, 1790, in the rolling fields of Charles City County, Virginia, a child was born into a family rooted in American tradition. His name was John Tyler, and, like his predecessor, William Henry Harrison, he was born into the world of Virginia aristocracy and revolution. His father, John Tyler Sr., was a judge, governor, and close ally of Thomas Jefferson. From a very early age, young John received a classical education based on states' rights and Southern pride. He graduated from the College of William and Mary at only 17 and became a lawyer at 19, but his true passion was politics. Tyler ascended rapidly on the political ladder, serving in the legislature of the state of Virginia, then in the House of Representatives of the United States, and, finally, as governor of Virginia and senator of the United States. He was a staunch defender of the rights of the states, wary of centralized federal power, and often stood alone in his votes, guided by his principles rather than by the party line. This independence earned him both admiration and isolation. Although, having been a Democrat, he became disillusioned with Andrew Jackson's authoritarian presidency and joined the Whig Party, a strange choice, but one that would mark his destiny. In 1840, the Whigs nominated war hero William Henry Harrison for the presidency and, needing to balance the candidacy with a Southern statesman, chose John Tyler as his running mate. The campaign was a spectacle of log cabins, cider barrels, and the immortal slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. It worked. Harrison won by a landslide, and Tyler became Vice President of the United States. Little did anyone imagine that he would be president in less than a month when Harrison died 31 days into his term. The nation plunged into confusion. The Constitution was ambiguous. Was Tyler the acting president or the new president? Tyler made his position clear. He was fully and officially president. He was sworn in, moved into the White House, and began exercising his presidential powers. Some mocked him for his accidental role, but he stood firm and asserted his right to the office. Tyler set a crucial precedent for presidential succession that would guide the nation for centuries. Once in office, Tyler clashed almost immediately with the Whig Party. He vetoed their plans to reestablish a national bank, which angered party leaders, including Henry Clay. The Whigs expelled him from the party, becoming the only president of the United States to lose the support of the party that had elected him. His cabinet resigned, including Secretary of State Daniel Webster, and Congress attempted to impeach him. Tyler was a man without a party who ruled alone, and yet he moved forward. Tyler's greatest achievements came in foreign policy. He signed the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which resolved border disputes with Great Britain, boosted trade with China, and sent the USS John Adams and USS Columbia ships to establish diplomatic relations. He advocated for the annexation of Texas, a measure that would later ignite sectarian tensions, but would also expand U.S. territory. He believed in a bold and expanding America, although his methods often caused controversy during his presidency. Tyler's beloved wife, Letitia Christian Tyler, died, becoming the First Lady to die in the White House. A year later, Tyler surprised Washington by marrying Julia Gardner, a 24-year-old socialite, 30 years his junior. They became the first presidential couple to marry while in office. They had 7 children, in addition to the 8 he had with Letitia. In total, Tyler had 15 children, more than any other United States president. Tyler considered the annexation of Texas his greatest achievement, although it was initially rejected by Congress. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes and, just before leaving office in 1845, secured a joint resolution to admit Texas as a state, which boosted expansion but also deepened the division between the North and South over slavery. It was the crowning achievement of a man few expected. After leaving office, Tyler returned to the Sherwood Forest Plantation in Virginia, but when the Southern states seceded in 1861, Tyler maintained his loyalty to his native South. He opposed the war, but eventually joined the Confederate Congress, becoming the only former president of the United States to take that step. He died before taking office on January 18, 1862. In the North, his death was ignored. In the South, he was buried with honors. John Tyler defied party lines, shattered expectations, and rewrote constitutional precedents. He was a president who shouldn't have been, and yet he reformed the office forever. Some call him stubborn, others call him a man of principle, but all agree that he was important. His story is one of unexpected power, solitary leadership, and quiet determination. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man walking alone through the halls of the White House, knowing that the nation doubts him, but leading anyway. Imagine a pen scribbling letters to foreign dignitaries, with his mind burning with plans to secure borders, break ground, and expand an incipient union because John Tyler believed in the Constitution above all else. The presidency endured even when the world was unsure how. Polk, the relentless visionary, on November 2, 1795, in a log cabin in Pineville, North Carolina, a child was born who would one day redraw the map of a nation. His name was James Knox Polk, and, from his humble origins on the border, he would become one of the most determined and underrated presidents in U.S. history. Sickly as a child, and often sore due to the gist, the young James underwent an operation at age 17 without anesthesia. The pain would mark him, but so would the strength he developed by surviving. He was quiet, focused, and serious. His mother instilled in him deep religious values, while his father fostered his ambition. Polk graduated from the University of North Carolina with high honors and a reputation as a sharp debater. After studying law in Tennessee with Felix Grundy, he opened a law firm and quickly entered politics. He was elected a member of the Legislative Assembly of Tennessee and, in 1825, of the House of Representatives of the United States, where he would serve for 14 years. Polk was a staunch Jacksonian Democrat, devoted to the vision of Andrew Jackson of limited expansion of the government and populist. He ascended to become Speaker of the House of Representatives, the only president in history ever to hold that position. After a brief stint as governor of Tennessee, Polk seemed to disappear from the political landscape until 1844, when the Democratic National Convention found itself at an impasse. Martin Van Buren was unable to get enough support due to his opposition to the annexation of Texas, and with no clear alternative, a compromise emerged: James K. Polk. He was nicknamed the surprise, unexpected, modest, yet perfectly balanced candidate. He ran on an electoral program that included the annexation of Texas, the claim of United States rights over Oregon Territory, and the acquisition of California from Mexico. He promised to serve only one term, but to carry out his plans, he entered the White House in 1845 with a very clear agenda: to reduce tariffs to promote trade, establish an independent treasury, resolve the Oregon border with Great Britain, and acquire California and the Southwest from Mexico, the dream of most presidents. Polk worked tirelessly, often late into the night, reading all the bills, drafting his own speeches, and maintaining an exhausting schedule. Even his cabinet members struggled to keep up. He was intense, precise, and disciplined, a man of few words, but with powerful results. In a matter of months, Polk had re-established the independent treasury system, passed the Walker Tariff, one of the lowest in United States history, and negotiated the Oregon Treaty with Great Britain, which established the border at the 49th parallel. But his most dramatic and controversial achievement came in the West in 1845, when Texas was annexed to the Union, triggering tensions with Mexico, which still claimed the territory. Polk sent troops to the disputed border, and when Mexican forces attacked, war was declared. The war between Mexico and the United States, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, was one of Polk's most decisive chapters. Critics called it a war of aggression, but Polk defended it as a matter of honor and national destiny. United States forces under Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott captured key cities, including Mexico City. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, granted the United States more than 500,000 square miles of territory, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Nevada. In just 4 years, Polk had added more territory to the United States than any other president. True to his promise, Polk did not run for re-election. He had set goals, achieved them, and left office exhausted, but the consequences of his expansion were profound. The new territories revived debates about slavery, laying the foundation for the Civil War. Although he had achieved more in one term than many presidents in two, his legacy was complicated. He returned to Tennessee, finally free to rest, only 3 months after leaving office. James K. Polk died of exhaustion and illness on June 15, 1849, at the age of 53. He had worked to exhaustion, dedicating his life to the presidency. His wife, Sarah Childress Polk, would live another 42 years, fiercely defending his legacy. He was buried at his home in Nashville, and later his remains were moved to the grounds of the Tennessee state capitol. Polk is rarely among the most famous presidents, but historians admire him for being one of the few politicians who kept his promises. He was methodical, intrepid, and effective, although not without controversy. His expansionist policies fulfilled the dream of manifest destiny, but deepened the divisions that almost destroyed the Union. Even so, he reshaped the United States forever. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man hunched over a desk illuminated by candlelight, scribbling plans westward, balancing budgets, and securing the destiny of a young nation. Imagine yourself standing before a map of North America, envisioning a United States that stretched from coast to coast, and then making it a reality, because James K. Polk believed in action over applause. He changed the course of a continent. Zachary Taylor, the horse soldier. On November 24, 1784, in a small wooden cabin in Orange County, Virginia, a boy was born who would spend most of his life on horseback. His name was Zachary Taylor, and although no one would have imagined it then, he would ride from the wild frontiers of the early United States to the White House. Shortly after his birth, the Taylor family moved to Kentucky, where they settled near the banks of the Ohio River. It was a rugged area, full of dangers, promises, and the spirit of westward expansion. Zachary grew up strong, rough, and unrefined. He only received a basic education, but he was tough, loyal, and brave. In 1808, Taylor enlisted in the United States Army as a first lieutenant, not for fame or glory, but out of duty. What began as a modest position became a military career that spanned 4 decades. He fought in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, and the Second Seminole War, but it was during the Mexican-American War that Taylor really rose to national fame with his gruff demeanor, simple language, and love of simple comforts. The soldiers called him Old Rough and Ready. He led from the front, slept in tents with his men, and earned their unwavering loyalty. In 1846, when the war with Mexico broke out, Taylor was placed in command of American forces. He obtained crucial victories in Palo Alto, Rocca, de la Palma, and Monterrey, but the Battle of Buena Vista in 1847 turned him into a legend. Outnumbered and outgunned, Taylor stood firm against the numerous Mexican army under General Santa Anna's command. His defiant message to Washington became famous: "I will win or die." He won, and the American public adored him without seeking it. Zachary Taylor had become a national hero. Taylor had never voted in a presidential election. He had no political experience, and he was not even sure to which party he belonged, and nevertheless, in 1848, the Whig Party nominated him for president. His war record, honesty, and nonpartisan image made him the perfect candidate for a nation tired of partisan disputes. He won the elections, defeating Lewis Cass and Martin Van Buren, and became the 12th president of the United States. "I'm a Whig, but not an ultra-Whig," he said, true to his independent vein. Taylor took office in March of 1849 and almost immediately faced the storm that was coming due to the conflict between the different regions over slavery and the new territories acquired after the war between Mexico and the United States. California requested free state status, which enraged the Southern leaders, who feared losing power. Although Taylor was a slaveholder, he opposed the expansion of slavery into the new territories and threatened to use military force against any state that tried to secede. "Disunion is treason," he declared. His position shocked the South and redefined the narrative about who Zachary Taylor really was. On July 4th, 1850, after attending Independence Day ceremonies under scorching heat, Taylor returned to the White House, ate raw fruit and cold milk, and became seriously ill. In 5 days, he had passed away. On July 9th, 1850, the cause of death remains a matter of debate: acute gastroenteritis or something darker. But what is clear is that Zachary Taylor's presidency lasted only 16 months. He was the second president to die in office. Although brief, Taylor's presidency revealed a man of principles willing to confront powerful interests to preserve the Union. He did not like politics, but loved his country. His unexpected death paved the way for Millard Fillmore, who signed the Compromise of 1850. Some believe that Taylor would have opposed it. His family buried him in Louisville, Kentucky, where his tomb is still located. Zachary Taylor was not refined or poetic, but he was honest, brave, and loyal to the men he led and the country he served. He spent more time in tents than in halls, more years on horseback than in debates, and when called to lead, he did not hesitate. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a dusty soldier with skin tanned by the sun, sitting next to a bonfire with his jacket unbuttoned and sword at his side. Imagine him rising to lead the men in battle and later, rising to lead a fractured nation with the same determination and the same silent resolution, because Zachary Taylor believed in doing what was right, not what was easy. He earned the trust of a nation. Millard Fillmore, the gentleman from Buffalo, on a snowy winter night on January 7th, 1800, in a modest wooden cabin nestled in the hills of Cuga County, New York, a child was born in poverty and hardship. His name was Millard Fillmore, and although the world he came to was cold and austere, he would come to stand under the great dome of the Capitol of the United States as the 13th President of the United States. His father, Nathaniel Fillmore, was a tenant farmer, and young Millard grew up knowing the bitter reality of poverty. He had no tutors, no refined manners, no famous last name, only the love for books, the desire to learn, and the latent ambition of a child who refused to stay small. He was largely self-taught, learning on his own by the light of the fireplace and borrowing all the books he found. He was an apprentice fabric maker and later studied law, gathering enough money to attend the New Hope Academy and later become a lawyer in Buffalo, New York. His life was not predestined, but sculpted with stubborn hands in the midst of difficulties. In Buffalo, Fillmore quickly earned respect for his diligence, modesty, and fairness. He was soft-spoken, courteous, and demanding. He married his childhood sweetheart, Abigail Powers, a school teacher as serious and bookish as him. Together, they built a home of quiet learning and mutual ambition. In 1828, Fillmore was elected a member of the New York State Assembly and, in 1832, to the United States House of Representatives, where he held several positions. A member of the Whig Party, he supported economic modernization, the American system, and internal improvements such as roads and canals. He was not an agitator, but a listener, a negotiator, a man who preferred thoughtful compromises to bold statements. But in a time of storm, that gentle temperament would become both his strength and burden. After Congress, Fillmore held the position of Comptroller of the State of New York, introducing accountability and reform to public finances. He also helped found the University of Buffalo, of which he was its first president. For him, education was not just a ladder, it was a legacy. In 1848, the Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor, the war hero, for the presidency, and, to balance the candidacy with a Northerner and a moderate, selected Millard Fillmore as vice president. The combination was unusual, a gruff general and a quiet legalist, but it worked. They won the elections, and Fillmore, as vice president, had little influence. Taylor largely ignored him, but everything changed when President Taylor died unexpectedly in July 1850, which led Fillmore to the highest office in the country. The nation he inherited was on the verge of collapse. The debate about slavery in the new territories had reached its peak. California wanted to join as a free state, and the Southerners threatened secession. The Congress was at a standstill. Fillmore, the accidental one, was in the center of it all, holding a fragile union in trembling hands. For many, Millard Fillmore will always be remembered for signing the Compromise of 1850, a package of laws intended to calm the fury between North and South. California entered as a free state. The slave trade was abolished, but not slavery itself, and Washington, D.C., Utah, and New Mexico were organized as territories without restrictions on slavery, and the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, which forced fugitive slaves to be returned to their owners, even from free states. Fillmore believed that the compromise would save the Union. He called it the definitive agreement on the expansion of slavery and signed all its components, including the Fugitive Slave Law, though he did so with great reluctance. Many in the North never forgave him. The compromise temporarily silenced the secessionist rumors, but further polarized the country. The abolitionists of the North burned effigies of Fillmore. The radicals of the South already distrusted him, and the Whig Party, already divided, began to fracture. Although the situation was irreparable, Fillmore stood firm. He believed in the Constitution above politics, in the Union above parties, and in peace above ideology. He modernized the White House, reinforced the Navy, and sent Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan, laying the foundations for future trade relations with Asia. These initiatives in matters of foreign affairs would not bear fruit in his time, but nevertheless, he planted seeds. In 1852, Fillmore did not get the nomination of the Whig Party, losing to Winfield Scott. The Whig makers lost the elections, and the party was practically disintegrated. In 1856, Fillmore returned once again, this time as a candidate of the Know Nothing Party, an ephemeral movement based on nativism and opposition to immigration. He did not present himself to win, but to restore order and balance. He only won in Maryland, but his presence in the race divided the votes and foreshadowed the rise of the Republican Party. After that, Fillmore retired definitively from politics. Fillmore spent his last years in Buffalo, where he became a beloved civic leader. He founded libraries, was part of hospital boards, and helped rebuild the city after a devastating fire. His beloved Abigail had died while he was president in 1858. He married Caroline Carmichael, a very cultured widow. He died on March 8, 1874, at the age of 74. By then, the Civil War had already come and gone, and the compromise that he once hoped would save the nation had only delayed the inevitable. Millard Fillmore was not a visionary or a warrior. He did not light fires, but tried to put them out. He was a man of books and balance, a man who rose from poverty to the presidency with no more help than his own mind and effort. He is remembered with complexity, even with controversy, but behind the compromise was a man who was desperately trying to keep a nation together. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a small house in Buffalo heated by a fireplace. Inside, a quiet man, with silver hair, is bent over a book, reading by candlelight. He is not dreaming of power. He is dreaming of peace. He is waiting for his country to remember the power of patience, learning, and compromise, because Millard Fillmore believed that unity is built with ordinary people who do their part in silence, even when the noise of history is deafening. Franklin Pierce. The beautiful tragedy on an autumn morning, on November 23, 1804, in a small town called Hillsborough, in New Hampshire, a child opened his eyes to the world. His name was Franklin Pierce, and, although no seer could have predicted it, one day he would become the 14th President of the United States. He was the son of Benjamin Pierce, a veteran of the War of Independence and twice governor of New Hampshire. The Pierce family was humble, but loving and full of duty and service toward the Republic. Young Franklin was charming, kind, and very loved. He had a kind smile, a twinkle in his eyes, and a sweetness in his soul. He studied at Bowdoin College, where he shared a room with the future writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, with whom he struck up a friendship that would last a lifetime. His classmates highlighted his warmth, his wit, and his ability to win the hearts of others with his speeches. Although he was gifted with charm and eloquence, his life would be overshadowed by loss and pain. In his mid-20s, Pierce had already been elected a member of the Legislative Assembly of New Hampshire and then to the House and later to the Senate, being the youngest member at that time. However, despite his rapid political rise, he remained humble and affable in his manner. He abhorred confrontation and deeply believed in union. He married Jane Means Appleton, the delicate and religious daughter of a university president, where Franklin was sociable and affable. Jane was shy and melancholic. Their love was tender, but tragic. She hated politics and the pomp of Washington. He loved her deeply and often sacrificed his ambitions to keep her happy. In 1842, he resigned from the Senate to return to New Hampshire and dedicate himself to private law practice, putting family before politics, but destiny did not allow him to remain long in the quiet hills. When the war with Mexico broke out in 1846, Pierce enlisted as a volunteer and President Polk appointed him brigadier general. Although some mocked him for his inexperience, Pierce demonstrated courage in battle, leading the troops in difficult terrain despite a debilitating leg injury. He returned home as a hero, and his victories were proof for himself and for others that he was not only charming, but also brave. His name once again gained importance at the national level, although he was not seeking glory. In 1852, At the Democratic National Convention, the party leaders were at an impasse after 48 votes, so they resorted to a compromise. Franklin Pierce, the unifying figure who offended few and charmed many. He had been out of politics for a decade and was practically unknown on the national scene. But his physical attractiveness, his military service, and his impeccable record made him the perfect candidate against the aging war hero Winfield Scott. Pierce campaigned in favor of unity, peace, and democratic values, and won by an overwhelming majority. Just a few weeks before the day of the inauguration, tragedy struck Franklin, Jane, and their son Benjamin, the last of their 3 children who were traveling by train. A sudden derailment threw the wagons off the tracks, and little Benny died beheaded before their eyes. Jane was devastated. She believed that the presidency was a punishment from God and locked herself in mourning. Franklin was shattered and entered the White House with a broken heart. Pierce's presidency began with great hopes, but quickly fell apart. He supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed the territories to decide the question of slavery through popular sovereignty. Pierce believed that this would calm tensions between the different factions, but instead unleashed the violence known as Bleeding Kansas, when pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed. The inability of his administration to quell the bloodshed eroded his popularity. He imposed the Fugitive Slave Act, which angered the abolitionists of the North, and his firm stance in maintaining the support of the South cost him the confidence of his party. He was called Doughface, a Northerner with Southern sympathies. His vision of the Union at all costs seemed blind to the growing moral crisis. In 1856, the Democrats abandoned Pierce and nominated James Buchanan in his place. Franklin returned to New Hampshire as a defeated and afflicted man. He and Jane lived quietly. She remained in mourning until her death in 1863. Pierce never recovered from the loss of his children, his wife, and his reputation. When the Civil War broke out, he opposed secession, but criticized Lincoln's use of powers in times of war. His former allies turned their backs on him. The one who was a beloved speaker and friend of the president's became a solitary relic of a bygone era. His alcoholism increased. His correspondence with Nathaniel Hawthorne remained one of his few comforts. Franklin Pierce died on October 8, 1869, at the age of 64 in Concord, New Hampshire. His passing went almost unnoticed. His presidency is remembered as a warning. But even in failure, there was depth in his struggle, a man caught between love and duty, torn by national division, and, ultimately, overwhelmed by grief. Franklin Pierce rarely appears on lists of great presidents. He is remembered more for what he did not do, for the crisis he could not stop and the peace he could not preserve. But behind the disappointment, there was a man who deeply believed in the Union, who fiercely loved his family, and who desired reconciliation more than power. Perhaps he was not made for the stormy world of politics of the 1850s. Perhaps he was a man too gentle, too afflicted by a nation approaching war. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a quiet room in a house in New Hampshire. A man is sitting alone by the fire, with a letter from an old friend in one hand and a glass in the other. He is not plotting plans to achieve power, but remembering a small child with a bright smile and the soft laughter of his wife. A country that once felt complete because Franklin Pierce believed in unity more than in politics and in peace. More than pride. He became a portrait of pain in an era of a country that once felt complete because Franklin Pierce believed in unity more than in politics and in peace. More than pride. He became a portrait of pain in an era of fury. James Buchanan, the bachelor in the storm. On April 23, 1791, in a log cabin in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, a boy was born to a merchant and frontier farmer. He was called James Buchanan, and he would become a man of refined manners, brilliant in the legal field and with complex contradictions. The only single president of the history of the United States, and the last one in leading the country before the storm of the Civil War broke out. Raised in a prosperous Scottish-Irish family, Buchanan studied at Dickinson College, where he earned a reputation for both his mischief and his intellect. After graduating and studying law, He opened a successful law firm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and soon became one of the most respected lawyers in the state. But Buchanan's life would never be limited to the courts. Politics whispered in his ear, and he answered the call. Buchanan entered the House of Representatives of Pennsylvania when he was in his 20s and then quickly moved to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served for 10 years as a Federalist and then as a Democrat. He was elegant, persuasive, and meticulous, a man who valued law, order, and diplomacy above all. Tall, courteous, and always impeccably dressed, Buchanan became a regular figure in Washington. He was engaged to in Coleman, but their relationship ended in a painful breakup and died shortly after, and Buchanan never married, dedicating himself completely to public service during the following decades. Buchanan was minister in Russia under the mandate of Andrew Jackson, senator of Pennsylvania, and Secretary of State under the mandate of James K. Polk, where he helped oversee the resolution of the Oregon border dispute and supported the war between Mexico and the United States in 1853. President Franklin Pierce appointed a minister to Great Britain, where Buchanan helped negotiate the controversial Ostend Manifesto, which advocated the acquisition of Cuba by the United States. The document subsequently provoked a strong reaction, but the time that Buchanan spent abroad kept him away from the growing political chaos in his country, something that his supporters would use to their advantage. In 1856, the United States was torn apart by slavery, territorial expansion, and the sovereignty of the states. Buchanan's long curriculum, his moderate stance, and his absence in the debates on Kansas-Nebraska made him the ideal Democratic candidate. He faced the Republican John C. Froor and former President Millard Fillmore, and won the presidency with the support of the South and the Northern Democrats. He would become the 15th president of the United States, inheriting a union plagued by tensions from the beginning. Buchanan sought to be a guardian of the Constitution, believing that compromise and the law would keep the nation united, but his efforts often appeased the South and alienated the North. He supported the pro-slavery Constitution of L. Compton in Kansas, despite the obvious corruption in the process, since he believed that slavery was a matter that should be decided by the states and territories, and not the federal government. Then came the infamous Dred Scott decision, in which the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in the territories. Buchanan had pressured the court behind the scenes, which was a violation of executive impartiality that damaged his credibility. During Buchanan's last year in office, the crisis worsened. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry shocked the nation. The Democratic Party split into regional factions. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 without a single vote from the South. One after another, the Southern states seceded from the Union. Buchanan, paralyzed by legalism, declared secession illegal, but also affirmed that the federal government had no authority to prevent it. He did nothing to prevent the taking of federal forts, arsenals, and naval shipyards throughout the South, while the Union fractured. Buchanan insisted that the Constitution offered no remedy except patience. In March 1861, Buchanan handed over the presidency to Abraham Lincoln. Upon leaving the White House, he is said to have told his successor, "If you are as happy to assume the presidency as I am to leave it, you are a very happy man." He returned to Wheatland, his Pennsylvania estate, where he spent the rest of his life writing his memoirs in death. He died on June 1st, 1868, a year after the end of the Civil War. James Buchanan is often listed among the least effective presidents of the United States, and he is blamed for not having acted at the most critical moment in the history of the Union. And yet he was not a malicious man, but a man of law, trained in diplomacy, who believed that compromise could heal any wound, but the nation needed courage, not caution. It needed vision, not delay. His tragedy was not his intention, but his inaction. When closing your eyes and letting yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a large estate in Pennsylvania, with its corridors full of books, illuminated by candlelight, a gray-haired man sitting at a desk, with a pen in his hand, trying to explain what went wrong. He was not a tyrant, nor a villain, just a man who could not stop a rising tide, because James Buchanan believed that the Constitution could contain the storm. He waited for peace while the war advanced. Abraham Lincoln, the emancipator, the light of a quiet Sunday morning on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, a child was born who would one day redefine the freedom of a nation. His name was Abraham Lincoln, and, from his humble origins, he would become the 16th President of the United States and one of the most beloved. He was the son of Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, frontier farmers with modest resources. Life was hard. The family moved often and finally settled in Indiana and later in Illinois. Lincoln's mother died when he was 9 years old, leaving him a tender scar that never fully healed. He had less than a year of formal education, but he devoured every book he found: the Bible, Shakespeare, and law books. The books shaped his mind, which was not formed in the classrooms of the academy, but under the light of oil lamps in the desert. Tall, lanky, and clumsy, he became famous for his quick wit, his deep melancholy, and his extraordinary wisdom. As a young man, Lincoln worked as a lumberjack, clerk, postman, and surveyor, gradually forging a reputation for himself in New Ulm and then in Springfield, Illinois. He studied on his own, passed the bar exam in 1836, and began practice in Springfield. He traveled on horseback through the circuit courts, where he became famous as a captivating storyteller, with a sharp legal mind and a man of absolute honesty, which earned him the nickname Honest Abe. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, a witty woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Their marriage was often tempestuous, yet full of affection. They had 4 children, though only one, Robert, survived to adulthood. Lincoln served in the Illinois State Legislative Assembly as a member of the Whig Party and later won a seat in Congress. He opposed the war between Mexico and the United States and denounced the expansion of slavery, but his views were not yet radical. For a time, he returned to law with an uncertain political future. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which permitted the expansion of slavery into new territories. Lincoln was horrified and returned to politics with a new purpose: to help build the Republican Party, founded to oppose the expansion of slavery. He was not strictly an abolitionist, but he believed that slavery was morally wrong and politically corrosive. Then came 1858 and the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which Lincoln faced Senator Stephen A. Douglas in a series of debates throughout Illinois, dazzling with his moral clarity and sharp rhetoric. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he declared. "I believe this government cannot endure half slave and half free." He lost the Senate election, but gained national fame. In 1860, he secured the Republican nomination for president and won the general election, defeating a fractured Democratic field. The South viewed his election as a threat even before his inauguration. 7 states seceded. Abraham Lincoln entered the White House in March 1861 with the nation falling apart. In April, Fort Sumter was attacked, and the Civil War began. Lincoln was an unlikely war president with no military or battlefield experience, but he proved to be a master strategist, carefully choosing his commanders after many mistakes, managing public opinion, and expanding executive powers. He faced criticism from all fronts: too slow to act, too fast, too radical, not quite radical enough. However, despite everything, he stood firm, read poetry when he was alone, walked the White House sadly, and buried 2 of his children while in office. However, he carried the weight of a dying and reborn nation. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in Confederate-controlled territories to be free. It did not end slavery completely. That would require a constitutional amendment, but it transformed the war into a moral crusade and allowed black soldiers to enlist in the Union Army. "If my name goes down in history," he said, "it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." It was the boldest step of his presidency. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to a battlefield in Pennsylvania to dedicate a cemetery. In just 272 words, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a speech that redefined American democracy. government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war dragged on, bloody and uncertain, but Lincoln remained committed to reunification and mercy, refusing to demonize the South. In 1864, Lincoln was re-elected amid exhaustion and loss. His second term began with hope. General Ulysses S. Grant was approaching victory, and Lincoln spoke of reconciliation, with malice toward none and with charity for all. We bind up the nation's wounds. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. Just 5 days later, on April 14th, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater, where he was shot dead by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. He died the following morning. Lincoln's death shocked the world. His funeral train passed through cities where millions mourned him. He was not just a president. He had become a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and the promise of the United States. He preserved the Union, ended slavery, and redefined freedom. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a tall figure walking slowly through the White House reading Shakespeare by candlelight, with pain in his eyes but iron in his soul. Imagine him leaning over the desk to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, not as a mere gesture, but as the rebirth of the nation. Imagine him among the crowd in Gettysburg uttering words that still resonate through the centuries. Because Abraham Lincoln believed in the best angels of our nature and, in doing so, helped save a shattered country. Andrew Johnson, the tailor during the turmoil. On December 29, 1808, in a small wooden cabin in Raleigh, North Carolina, a child was born amid adversity. His name was Andrew Johnson, and he went from poverty and illiteracy to become the 17th President of the United States. His father died when Andrew was only 3 years old, and his mother was a woman who struggled to support the family. At 10 years old, Johnson was a tailor's apprentice and never received a formal education, but he was insightful, observant, and motivated. While he sewed coats and pants, he listened to political debates and absorbed the voices of the people. With sheer determination, he learned to read on his own. His wife, Eliza Martle, helped him improve his writing and oral expression. They built a quiet life in Greenville, Tennessee, where he opened his own tailor shop and eventually entered politics. Johnson ascended rapidly in Tennessee politics, becoming mayor, state legislator, United States congressman, and finally, governor of Tennessee. He was a populist before the term existed, defending small farmers, mechanics, and the working class. He opposed the elite planters and considered slavery a system that oppressed poor whites, in addition to enslaving African Americans, although he himself was a slave owner for much of his life. In 1857, he entered the United States Senate, and, although he was a Southern Democrat, he remained loyal to the Union when the Civil War was looming. When Tennessee seceded, Johnson was the only Southern senator who refused to leave the Senate. Lincoln admired him during the Civil War. Johnson was appointed military governor of Tennessee and worked to restore order and protect Union sympathizers. In 1864, in his attempt to unify the North and the South, Lincoln chose Johnson as his vice president in the National Union candidacy, a bold decision that paired a Southern Democrat with a Northern Republican. The candidacy won, but within weeks of beginning his second term, tragedy befell them. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated, and the following morning, Andrew Johnson took possession of the office. Johnson inherited a nation in ruins, with its heart broken by war and an assassination. But Johnson was not Lincoln. He sought the rapid restoration of the Southern states, offering leniency to former Confederates and opposing efforts to protect the rights of newly freed slaves. He vetoed fundamental laws on civil rights, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the bills that established the Freedmen's Bureau. Congress overturned his vetoes, which was the first time in United States history that an important law was passed despite the objections of the president. Johnson's presidency became a war, not against foreign powers, but against Congress itself. The radical Republicans in Congress, led by men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, believed that Johnson was undermining Reconstruction and facilitating Southern resistance. When Johnson tried to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, in violation of the newly passed Tenure of Office Act, Congress said enough. In 1868, Johnson became the first president to be subjected to an impeachment trial. The trial in the Senate was a national spectacle. Johnson was accused of violating the Tenure of Office Act, but the deeper problem was his defiance of Congress and obstruction of Reconstruction. He was acquitted by one vote. As a single Republican senator, Edmund G. Ross broke ranks. Ross broke ranks by considering that the trial had political motivations. Johnson remained in office, but his power was shattered after the end of his term in 1869. Johnson returned to Greenville and tried to remain involved in politics, unsuccessfully running as a candidate for the Senate and the House of Representatives. Finally, in 1875, he was elected to the United States Senate, becoming the only former president to return to the Senate. He was only in office for a few months, as he died of a stroke on July 31, 1875. Andrew Johnson is remembered as a president who opposed progress at a critical moment, who valued the past above civil rights, and his obstruction of Reconstruction delayed justice and equality for millions of people. However, he was also a persevering man who rose from nothing, remained loyal in an era of betrayal, and stood firm in his beliefs, however wrong they may have been. Close your eyes and let yourself go in dreams. Imagine a man bent over a needle and thread, sewing coats for farmers and preachers, listening to voices that resonated in history. Imagine him sitting alone in a smoke-filled room, divided between the past and the future, struggling to understand the country he was trying to lead, because Andrew Johnson believed in repairing a broken Union, but lacked the vision to rebuild it. Ulysses S. Grant, the silent general, on April 27, 1822, in the river city of Point Pleasant, Ohio, a quiet boy named Rum Ulysses Grant was born. Later, due to a bureaucratic error in West Point, he would go down in history as Ulysses S. Grant, a name that would be engraved both on the battlefield and in the presidency. He was the son of Jesse and Hannah Grant, raised with strong values of hard work, humility, and perseverance. Young Ulysses preferred books to solitude and society. He was gentle, reserved, and had no dreams of greatness. At 17, he received a place at West Point. He did not want to go, but he went, and although he never excelled academically, he was an extraordinary writer, known for his quiet courage and silent determination. After graduating, Grant served with distinction in the war between Mexico and the United States under the command of General Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, where he acquired valuable military experience but also developed a rejection of war that would last a lifetime. He married Julia Dent, a Southern woman from a slave-owning family, with whom he shared a tender and lasting love. Together, they raised 4 children, but peace proved difficult. Assigned to remote forts and separated from his family, Grant struggled with depression and alcohol, a battle that he fought in silence throughout his life. In 1854, he resigned from the Army, and during the following years, he failed in agriculture, real estate, and business. In 1860, he worked in Galena, Illinois. Humble and almost forgotten, the Civil War arrived. When the war began in 1861, Grant offered his services to the Union and was appointed colonel and soon brigadier general. He quickly earned a reputation for his action and determination. His first great victory came at Fort Donelson, in Tennessee, where he demanded unconditional surrender, a phrase that captivated the nation and earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender. In Shiloh, he faced fierce criticism for the numerous casualties, but he refused to waver in his belief that wars are not won by timidity. President Lincoln saw something unusual in Grant, a man who fought and did not complain while other generals doubted. Grant moved forward and, in 1863, orchestrated one of the most brilliant campaigns of the war, the Siege of Vicksburg, which gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and divided the Confederacy in two. Lincoln rewarded Grant by placing him in command of all the armies of the Union. Grant moved east to face Robert Lee in a brutal campaign of attrition. The battles of Wilderness, Sylvania, and Cold Harbor were bloody and indecisive, but Grant continued forward, besieged Petersburg, and slowly strangled the supply lines of the Confederacy. Finally, on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The terms were generous. He allowed the Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and weapons. The war was over, and the rebels were compatriots again. Grant returned home as a national hero, celebrated with parades and songs. He had saved the Union and was admired for his humility, his calm leadership, and his quiet strength. In 1868, with the nation still in the process of recovery, the Republican Party nominated him as president. His campaign was simple: let us have peace. He won overwhelmingly and became the 18th president of the United States. Grant's presidency was marked by the struggle to rebuild the South and protect the rights of former slaves. He supported the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote to black men and used federal troops to fight the Ku Klux Klan. He created the Department of Justice, signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and appointed African Americans and American Jews to government positions. However, his presidency was also tarnished by corruption scandals. Grant was personally honest, but many of his appointees were not. The whiskey ring scandal, that of Credit Mobilier, and others stained his administration. Despite these failures, Grant remained deeply loyal, sometimes to a fault. After leaving office in 1877, Grant and Julia took a world tour where they were received by kings, queens, and emperors. He was treated as a global celebrity, admired for having guided his country in its darkest days, but financial problems awaited him in retirement. Grant trusted the wrong people and was scammed in a pyramid scheme, losing his entire fortune. Soon after he was diagnosed with throat cancer and facing death and poverty, he began to write his memoirs, an extraordinary account of his life and military career. He finished them a few days before he died, ensuring Julia's financial security. He died on July 23, 1885, and was mourned as a national treasure. Grant's reputation has risen and fallen over time. For years, he was remembered mainly for the scandals of his presidency, but in recent decades, historians have come to admire him as a defender of civil rights, a stabilizing force, and a remarkably humble leader. He was not a brilliant speaker, nor a political strategist. He was a man who acted when others hesitated, who stood firm when others faltered. He did not fight for glory, but to keep the Union together and guarantee freedom for all. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man in a dusty blue coat standing under the red and white stripes of a worn battle flag. He doesn't talk much. He writes, he rides, he remembers. He does not lead with ostentation or fury, but with unwavering determination, because Ulysses S. Grant believed in peace through perseverance and maintaining the line. He helped a wounded nation find its way. Rutherford B. Hayes, the gentleman of compromise. On October 4, 1822, in Delaware, Ohio, a child of Sophia Burchard Hayes was born, only 10 weeks after the death of her husband. She called him Rutherford Burchard Hayes, and, from the first moment, he lived in the shadow of absence and resilience. Sophia raised Rutherford and her sister with quiet strength and fierce independence. She read to them often, nurturing a love of books and a solid moral compass. Rutherford grew up bright, reflective, and soft-spoken, traits that would define his adult life. He studied at Kenyon College, where he graduated as valedictorian and later obtained a law degree from Harvard. He returned to Ohio to build a life as a lawyer, respected for his intellect and integrity. He married Lucy Ware, a cultured and principled woman who would become the first lady to have a college degree. Together, they raised 8 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood, and shared a deep commitment to abolitionism, temperance, and reform. When the Civil War broke out, Hayes did not hesitate, despite being almost 40 years old and the father of young children, and enlisted as a volunteer in the Union Army, quickly rising to the rank of brigadier general. He was wounded on multiple occasions, most seriously at South Mountain, where he continued to lead his men even after being shot in the arm. His courage earned him the loyalty of his troops and the admiration of his peers. After the war, Hayes entered politics, becoming a U.S. congressman and then governor of Ohio, earning a reputation as a moderate reformer. He was praised for his honesty, his defense of public education, and his efforts to support the rights of African Americans in the post-war era. In 1876, the Republican Party nominated Hayes for president, an honest and uncontroversial man in an era of widespread political fatigue and scandals. His opponent was the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, a reformist governor from New York. The election was one of the most disputed elections in the history of the United States. Tilden won the popular vote, but 20 electoral votes from 4 states were subject to dispute after weeks of confusion, secret negotiations, and a special electoral commission. An agreement was reached, the Compromise of 1877, whereby, in exchange for Hayes becoming president, the Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Rutherford B. Hayes secretly took office on March 3, 1877, under heavy guard. Although born of compromise, Hayes's presidency was guided by integrity and idealism. He believed in equal rights, civil service reform, and the reconciliation of a divided nation. He ended Reconstruction, convinced that the South could be reconciled through good faith, a belief that later proved tragically naive. He fought against political patronage, reformed the civil service, and paved the way for the subsequent Pendleton Act. He supported the education of African Americans and spoke openly about the need for racial justice, even as federal law enforcement weakened. He refused to seek a second term, remaining true to his promise to serve only one. Hayes was often criticized for being too passive and idealistic, but he governed with deep conviction and an unwavering ethic. After leaving office in 1881, Hayes retired to his Spiegel Grove estate in Fremont, Ohio, but retirement did not mean rest. He dedicated his time to promoting education, particularly for Black and Southern students, supporting prison reform, advocating for rehabilitation rather than punishment, advocating temperance and civic responsibility. He was appointed to several educational boards and philanthropic organizations, quietly continuing the work in which he believed. He and Lucy, his lifelong companion in heart and principles, remained faithful until her death in 1889. He followed her 4 years later, passing away on January 17, 1893. Rutherford B. Hayes is rarely among the most famous presidents of the United States. His name does not inspire monuments or dramatic legends, but his life was a model of modesty, service, and moral courage. He was a man who believed in doing what was right, not what was flashy. He sought to restore confidence in the presidency, smooth the scars of war, and guide a fractured nation toward hope. When you close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by dreams, imagine a man walking through a quiet forest in Ohio, with his hand on his waist, and thinking about the children studying in the schools he helped build. He smiles softly, not because he is famous, but because he served. Because Rutherford B. Hayes believed that leadership is not about power, but about purpose.